Behind me is the Gettysburg battlefield, specifically the high water mark of the Confederacy, as it's called, which is the culminating point of Pickett's famous charge on the third day of the battle. That would be July 3rd, 1863. Oftentimes, Gettysburg is considered to be the turning point of the Civil War, and the high water mark expression is intended to refer to the sort of the high water mark of Confederate fortunes, and the idea is that thereafter the Confederate was losing the war and would continue to lose it and up until the final surrenders in 1865, in the spring of 1865. In fact, that isn't correct. First of all, the Battle of Gettysburg, in and of itself, was not a decisive battle. It can be considered decisive only in combination with two other campaigns of 1863, the Vicksburg campaign and the Chattanooga campaign, which we'll be discussing in detail. The other thing to bear in mind is that the Confederacy had a good chance of winning the war up through November 1864, when there was a presidential election and Lincoln was reelected. And what that meant was that the Union was going to continue to prosecute the war vigorously until a victory over the Confederacy, achieving not just reunion, but also the final emancipation of enslaved Americans. Had his opponent, George B. McClellan, won the election, it is likely that there would have been some kind of negotiated peace. This is not something that McClellan himself wanted, but given the platform of the Democratic Party, which is the party for which he was running, that would have been the likely outcome. So let me share the screen with you. We're going to be looking at the campaigns of 1863 in this presentation. Okay. Here are the terms for this particular lecture. And by the end of this presentation, you should understand, first, Confederate and Union volunteer recruitment and how that operated in 1861, 1862. Then Confederate and Union conscription, draft laws, and policies that took hold in the Confederacy in April 1862, and in the Union starting in March of 1863. Then the Union recruitment of African-American labor and military manpower. The basic organization of Civil War armies. It's difficult to understand the campaigns of the Civil War without understanding how the armies were organized. The three Civil War theaters of operation, that would be the Trans-Mississippi, the Western Theater, and the Eastern Theater. We'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. The basics of the Gettysburg campaign, basics of the Vicksburg campaign, the basics of the Chattanooga campaign. And again, taken together, these three campaigns comprise the military turning point of the American Civil War. Next, we have the significance of those three decisive Union victories. And let's move on to the problem of military manpower. The Confederate government faced a severe manpower shortage as early as April 1862, and created a draft law that operated something like this. If you're already a volunteer in the Confederate forces, you enlisted for 12 months, your enlistment is about to expire. If you re-enlist, you can stay with your company, with your friends, with members from the community, with people with whom you're familiar. If you go home, and you can, then you're going to be liable to the draft. And so this kept a great many Confederate volunteers in the Army, and then thenceforth, additional Confederate recruits were obtained, mostly, though not entirely, through conscription. We estimate between 10 and 11%, 10 and 11% of Confederate troops ultimately were supplied to the Confederacy through conscription or through the draft. Now, later on, the Confederates created a kind of an amendment to their draft laws. Uh, the issue was you're putting so much white military manpower into the field that there was a perceived to be a problem with maintaining control over the enslaved African population that was back home. And so an amendment to the Conscription Acts was created, whereby for every 20 enslaved Africans back home, one able-bodied white man would be exempted from the draft in order to stay back home and help to maintain control over that African American population. This generated a sense among many white Southerners that this was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. The idea was that it was the rich, the sons of the planter class, those who owned 20 slaves or more, who were being exempted from the draft. In point of fact, there's not documentary evidence to support the idea that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, but that was the perception, and sometimes perception can be reality. By 1863, the year we're going to be focusing on, the Confederacy had nearly maximized its military strength, and ultimately, we think that about 800,000 Southern whites served in the Confederate Army. And at the same time, particularly as a result of the defeats, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, those campaigns, desertions began to become a problem in the Confederate South, and these desertions would become more severe through 1864, particularly into 1865. Desertion was an issue on the Union side as well, but not nearly to the same extent or with the same deleterious effects. Now, the Union side had two great waves of volunteering. The first one right after Fort Sumter, between April and July 1861, but these were called the Boys of 1861, the Boys of 61. Then there was another wave of volunteering when the Lincoln administration called for 300,000 additional volunteers. These came into the service in August 1862, primarily the Boys of 1862. The enlistments, of course, of the Boys of 1861, they were for 3 years, and which meant that those were going to expire in the late spring, summer of 1864. And then the enlistments of the Boys of 1862 were going to expire in the summer of 1865, which created a manpower problem, potential manpower problem for the Union Army as the war entered the years of 1864, 1865. Union volunteering had dried up by early 1863, and that forced the institution of this military draft. And this draft was very unpopular. And the way that the Union draft operated was that manpower drafts occurred according to district, and these districts usually corresponded to congressional district. And the idea was, hey, if you, the community, if you this district, give us enough volunteer soldiers, then we won't institute a draft where you live in your community. If you don't, then there's going to be a draft. And so to avoid the draft, communities began to entice men to enlist voluntarily through large sums of money. We're talking into the hundreds of dollars. Frequently, more money than a laborer could make in an entire year. And these bounties, did succeed in getting a lot of volunteers in the ranks. But from the standpoint of the good old rally around the flag volunteers, they were really skeptical about these so-called bounty men, wary of them, feeling that they would not be reliable on picket duty, would not be reliable in a fight. And indeed, some of these men who were enlisted by way of bounties, would desert, go to another community, enlist again, collect that bounty, and then desert another time. These were so-called bounty jumpers. And there is one Union volunteer who wrote a really good memoir of his experiences. And he talks. He was a volunteer, but he went by sea from the New York area, if I recall correctly, on down to join the Army of the Potomac down in Virginia. And he said that most of the guys that were aboard the ship along with him were bounty men, and that a number of them jumped overboard during the early stages of the trip. And there were sentries on guard who simply shot them to death in the water. So that's how severe the bounty man problem was. The draft also caused draft riots, and the worst of these occurred in New York City in July of 1863, culminating in 105 dead. This was the deadliest riot in American history. And somewhat ironically, soldiers who had recently fought in the Battle of Gettysburg were transferred to New York City to put down the riot, which really must have been, quite jarring for them to have gone from defending the Union to having and against Confederate forces, and now having to coerce and even fire upon their own American citizens for whom they had been thinking of themselves as having fought. African Americans, both free and enslaved, constituted the last major reservoir of military manpower. Now, recruitment of African American soldiers on the Union side began in mid-1862, but began on a major scale only in early 1863. And by the way, at the very beginning of the war, African American men attempted to join the Union Army and were basically told in no uncertain terms, very scornfully, "Hey, we don't want you. This is a white man's fight. We don't want you to be part of the army." But that thinking changed starting in 1862, and then particularly in 1863, driven by the fact that emancipation in the rebellious areas of the American South created free African Americans who could now serve in the Union Army. And of course, it was legal at this point for African Americans to serve in the Union Army. There was also this perception, even among really virulent racists in the North, that, hey, an African American body can stop a bullet as well as a white body. So let's go ahead and let these guys fight. African American soldiers, by the way, there was a deep suspicion of their fighting ability. And notwithstanding the fact that over and over again, in one battle after another, African American troops acquitted themselves very well, this skepticism continued. And so you would get this kind of narrative of, African American troops would fight very well in the Battle of Milliken's Bend. This is during the Vicksburg campaign, or the Battle of Port Hudson. And newspapermen would say, "Hey, the thing is settled. The Negro," as they're called back in those days, "the Negro will fight." And then there would be this memory dump. And then there'd be another fight, say at Fort Wagner, where the 54th Massachusetts fought in July 1863, very gallantly with great casualties. And the thing is settled. The Negro will fight. And then that got all memory dumped, and on and on. So what this meant is that, white skepticism of the ability of African Americans to hold up to the demands of military discipline and the kind of basic intelligence that was required to move and march and fight and so forth successfully. This prejudice against African Americans was so thick that there was a kind of a filter of prejudice against African Americans that made it very difficult, even in the face of glaring evidence to the contrary, very difficult for whites to really take in the fact that African Americans made at least as good soldiers as white Americans did. Now, before they were allowed to join the Union Army, and even after you get military recruitment in the Union Army, African Americans who came into Union lines were used as military laborers. And here are military laborers being used, we think, near Alexandria, Virginia, although the place isn't definite. You might think that these African American military laborers were volunteers, and many of them were, but some of them weren't. Uh, this is an engraving uh, of a scene in Nashville, Tennessee. And what has happened here is that the Union Army needs uh, African Americans to to perform construction duties for the Union Army. African Americans were even used to construct a short railroad outside of Nashville. And because they weren't volunteering, what would happen is, and this happened more than once, Union troops would surround an African American church on Sunday, and then when worship services ended, would seize these African Americans as they emerged from the church. And in this particular instance that's depicted, the Union soldiers have even invaded the church and captured African Americans for use as military laborers, even before the church service has adjourned for the day.